Digest. This is episode 82. My name's Dan Lizette. Thank you guys for taking a little bit of time out of your week, coming back and checking out another great episode of the show. Hope you guys enjoyed last week's show. Mr. Al Letson with Reveal and Thing. Getting a lot of great response on that, and I had a blast talking to Al last week. And really excited to tell you guys about my guest and his show this week. It is a pretty rare thing for me to come across a podcast, actually be directed to it, and we're going to talk about how I came across this one just this past 7 to 10 days, and start to listen to it, and within 1 or 2 episodes immediately know I wanted to talk to this host and creator and tell you guys all about it, because I think it's that good, it's that impressive, and I have a feeling you're going to feel the same way as well if you haven't checked it out. The show is called This Is Actually Happening. The host and creator is Whit Missildine. Am I saying that right, Whit?
You are.
All right, saying it right. Great. Whit, welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for coming aboard. As I mentioned, I came across your show, as you might be well aware, because I'm hoping a lot of people are finding it right now, from the Borrowed segment on Snap Judgment recently. And I really enjoyed that one. I believe that was on episode 705 of Snap Judgment. Dead Man Walking was the story, and then immediately hopped over and have been pretty much enthralled going through the back catalog. Haven't made it too far, maybe a dozen or so. I think most of the 5th season. But for folks who aren't familiar with you, I'd like them to get to know a little bit about you and your background a little bit, Whit. Can you tell folks sort of a little bit about your backstory and what your road was like to creating the show?
Sure. So I started out, I was a PhD student in social psychology. That's my background. I was, as a grad student, I was hired on to a grant to do HIV research. So we were doing this study on men who have sex with men. We were doing a therapeutic intervention, and I was the control group. So I was the person who would not deliver any therapy, but I would listen to all their stories, right? So there had to be someone in the room that was mimicking what it would be like to be in a therapeutic setting without actually delivering any therapy. And so I would just spend hours listening to these guys tell these unbelievable stories, just these really heartbreaking, heart-wrenching, complicated stories. And they would get fed into this study about unsafe sex patterns, and they would just become a data point. And I thought, this is not where the complexity lies, right? This is research, and we're not capturing all these hugely complex interweaving factors of race and class and sexual patterns. And it was that was the beginning of the spark. And all through graduate school, I had this kind of critique of social psychology and social science in general. When you study large behavior patterns, you end up being unable to capture the complexity of what it's like to be human on an everyday level. And while I love social psychology, I think there's a huge value in taking kind of the wide view. I always had this tendency to want to do a deep dive, and I never really had the forum to do it. And so I got my PhD, I started working, and podcasting really started to pick up around 2007. That's when I got my PhD. And a friend of mine, we started a podcast together that was called People Know Everything. And we did 3 episodes, and it immediately died. So it was a short-lived venture, but I loved it. And we had gathered a couple stories for that podcast that we never aired, and that was the birth of This Is Actually Happening.
And so the concept would be that through your course of getting through the schooling and through the studies, that you felt that there was intense stories or a side of humanity that just wasn't being captured by, say, a research project or a scientific study, that there were so many stories in there that the regular everyday people clearly don't have, the megaphone to put that story out to the world. So you thought this could be a basis of a great show. Exactly.
Yeah. And like I had said, I really admired documentary film. I love Errol Morris. I love Werner Herzog. Studs Terkel was a huge influence on me. He had a book called Working. I don't know if you've ever read that, but it is a brilliant book, and it's just people talking about what they do in their jobs every day. And it's just absolutely fascinating to get this raw take on people who do these thankless jobs and no one ever asks them about it. And he did. And it's a wonderful book. He did a number of other books and interviewers. He's a great one. And he was a huge inspiration. And yeah, I really wanted to capture the complexity of just the everyday human experience.
Well, there's lots to jump into with this is actually happening, and I've got a ton of questions for you. But before we do that, you touched on it once, so I'd like to talk a little bit about it. You also have done some films and documentary, correct?
I have, yep.
Let's talk about those. There are two, is that correct? If I'm reading your website correctly, right? Let's talk about those. What was the source of those? And let me ask you an obvious question, Whit, because somebody out there is asking. You spent your schooling time and came out with a PhD. How did you end up in documentaries and podcasts?
I did.
Somebody's wondering that, I'm sure.
Well, and I have a day job. I have a full-time job. I actually build simulation games for businesses and organizations. So I do have a regular day job, but I get to work from home. And so I have a lot of flexibility in my schedule. And the films and the podcast are my side projects.
Excellent. So the films you've done.
So the films I've done, the first one is called Being Toward Death, and it was about smoking. I was a 14-year pack-a-day smoker, and I was in the process of quitting, and I really became captivated by my own addiction, and I wanted to understand why we do something that we know is bad for us, that we know is going to kill us. And I've always kind of been fascinated in general. One of the reasons I'm interested in psychology is because I'm always fascinated by the disconnect we all feel between what we do and what we want to do, what we know is good for us or what we think we should be doing, and then our actual behavior. And everyone reconciles that differently, but addiction is a very acute window into why people do one thing even though they believe or think something differently. So I wanted to ask people just about why they smoke, and that's what the film is. It's a short film. It's only 16 minutes, I think. It's just people talking about why they smoke, and I would ask them about, this is killing you. Why do you do it? And it became fascinating, and I didn't want to use the word addiction at all in the film. So I never talked about it as an addiction. That's kind of been covered, I think, by a lot of other things. So that was my first venture. And I should mention, one of the best things that's happened to me in my life was meeting my friend Nathan Trimboli. He's just been a great friend for about 8 years, and he's a film editor, and he's brilliant, and we are collaborators. And without him, I wouldn't do the podcast, I wouldn't be in film, and I really owe this entire creative work to him in some sense. And so, yeah, and we just interviewed people, and one of the fascinating things about that documentary was so many people smoke out of boredom. They smoke to have something to do. I think it was so interesting that, and I realized it was one of the reasons I was smoking, is that when I was waiting for the bus or doing anything in my daily life, it was just nice to have like a friend around that was a cigarette. And there was sort of this sense in which we're uncomfortable. You're uncomfortable standing around doing nothing. In our society, we're always like goal directed, and we go places, and we have a purpose. And if you see someone on the street who doesn't seem to have a purpose, it's kind of odd. But if they're on the street without a purpose and they have a cigarette in their mouth, it makes sense to us. And there's this nice gap that cigarettes fill in our lives, and that kind of came across in the film. And it was one of the wonderful discoveries of the film. There was a lot more to it, but that was one. And then the second film we did was a feature length. It was about an hour long. It's called All Contained in Void, and it is about the dead zones in urban spaces created by freeway infrastructure and road infrastructure. And I live in Oakland, which is a wonderful city, but it's horribly planned, and all of these freeways cut up the city in very odd ways and create tons of dead space, and lots of homeless people and urban explorers and various anarchists occupy those spaces and make a lot of creative use out of it. and I wanted to capture their stories.
Excellent. And that is all on your website, and that's permatemp.org, correct?
That's right. And there's also thisisactuallyhappening.org. They both lead there.
Gotcha. Well, and folks, I'll have all these links in the show notes as well. Before we jump into the podcast, what is Permatemp?
Permatemp. Permatemp is actually an idea that I had coming out of grad school during the Bush era, when there was a lot of anti-corporate sentiment. There still is. I had this idea for an art project called the Permatemp Corporation. A permatemp is a permanent temporary employee of an organization. So companies will have moved long ago, but they continue to hire on people not full time, so that they don't have to give them benefits and they don't have to pay them a living wage. We see this with professors, and it started really with Microsoft, and there were some cases about it. So I thought, this is a funny, ironic thing, right? The Permatemp Corporation, a company that prides itself in abusing its employees. So it was sort of this art project. And yeah, it kind of became then my production company. I figured I wanted to put the podcast and my films under one umbrella. And the Permatemp Corporation is sort of the publishing company. I still make some art too as well. But that's a lesser focus, of course, now. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like you've got a rather full plate.
Yeah, exactly.
Day job, filmmaker, podcast, production host.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk about This Is Actually Happening. First of which, I thought was a brilliant name for the show, because the type of stories that you tell, and we're going to talk about them, sort of, it seems like that would be the inner thought of almost anyone going through this story. Talk to us a little bit about the history of the name of the show.
The name of the show is interesting. It comes from actually the preface to the book Lipstick Traces, which is a history of the situationists and surrealists of the 20th century. A brilliant book. And that book was made into a play when I was in college at the Ontological Hysteric Theater in New York City. And a friend of mine was working the door there, and they had to do promotion. And the preface to that book uses this phrase, "This is actually happening," as sort of a situationist expression. And so I was 19, 20 years old. We were promoting for that play, and we had these little black stickers that we were charged with putting around the East Village, putting on signs and buildings and random areas, stickering up the city, and it just said, "This is actually happening," and it was an advertisement for the play, and that really stuck with me. It's a great phrase, and when I started getting the idea for my show, I'm like, this is perfect, and there was no podcast called that yet, so I got it.
It's perfect, and it's so perfect given the context of these episodes, because as I mentioned, it just seems like to me that so many of these individuals may have had that actual thought while living out some of these stories that they're telling, which is why I just thought it was such a fitting title. So let's talk about some of these stories. Some of these are amazing, but let's go all the way back to the beginning if we can. And really, I'd like to learn with the listeners at this point, because as I said, I've really sampled a lot of the most recent season. But let's go back to the beginning and sort of some of the original ideas. We've touched on it a little bit, but how did this show get off the ground?
The first episode really came about with a friend of my then girlfriend and now wife. She had recently gotten out of a relationship that had ended with her boyfriend committing suicide by lighting himself on fire. And she was in this wonderful relationship that started out great, and it started to slowly devolve. And it turned out that the boyfriend was developing a mental disorder, and he started spinning out of control, and she was really caught up in that. And he ended up having a mental breakdown, got in a car accident with his father, who became paralyzed. And then he was put in a mental institution and ended up lighting himself on fire and actually burned down part of the mental institution as a result, and died. And I kind of met her right after she was in the thick of that grief process. I never knew him, but it was just a really harrowing story. And a couple of my friends had really wild stories. I had moved to San Francisco from New York City in 2007, and San Francisco is a great place for interesting, wild, weird people who are all deeply thinking about what they want to do with their lives. And I was, my late 20s, early 30s, which is also a big inflection point in a person's life. And I was going through a breakup of my own, and it was a really raw kind of period for me. And after that initial story with her, that was the story I had captured for our previous podcast that we made before I did this one. And it was really powerful. And so, actually probably the first 10 or 20 episodes, I would say about half of those are people that are friends or friends of friends that had just had stories that were life-changing in one sense or another.
And it's amazing, some of these stories. What's funny is not funny. It is mind-blowing to scroll through your website looking at some of the titles, which I don't know if this was I imagine this was an intended thought, but the idea of the episode titles with questions are awesome, because you scroll through this list and folks, let me just run down some of these episodes. We'll just focus on season 1. As Whit just mentioned, the episode title, the first one was "What If Your Boyfriend Lit Himself on Fire?" What If You Weren't Afraid to Die is episode 6. What If You Were Falsely Accused of Pedophilia is episode 8. What If You Learned How to Swim at 43 is episode 14. So you can see this is super intriguing just in the title, which is one of the reasons why I've put in like 10 or 12 episodes just in the last 4 or 5 days. So what was the thought process with the episode titles? And you mentioned some of them were friends, but how did you find some of these people that you didn't know?
A major purpose behind the show is, I've always lived in cities. I love urban environments. I love the subways. I love BART in San Francisco. And you sit on a train with 50 other people, and we get so numb to their experiences. And each of them has some incredible story to tell. And I think the show titles come from the sense that it's like, what if you were that person? What if I was this person? And I think constantly having that as a practice we do in our everyday life is what really makes us human and what makes us better people. And so not only does it serve as a intriguing title format, I always want to place the listener in that person's shoes. It's why I love that it's anonymous. I love that it's radio. I think video actually sort of triggers our stereotypes a lot more than radio does. I think radio is so powerful because it allows us to be in someone else's shoes and really be in their head for as long as that episode is going on. So that was the thrust behind the titles. And then what was your second question?
How do you find some of these stories outside of these most amazing personal tales inside your immediate friend circle? Had to get exhausted at some point. Then how do you continue to find these people with super interesting stories and experiences?
My initial method, and it's a method I still use, is Craigslist. And they have an etc. job section, and I just post. That's where they tend to post, participate in a medical study or some research. And I just post on there, what is your unusual life-changing event? And I typically get about 15 to 20 responses, and I probably interview about 4 or 5 of those. And then probably 3 or 4 of those will become actual episodes. So, so Craigslist.
Wow. I had not heard of that before, which is, now I'm going to go into that section. I'm going to go into that section of Craigslist now and see if, although I don't know that I have a story anywhere near as intriguing as some of these, is there a couple that really stand out to you as, like, I cannot believe I'm hearing this?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, what is intriguing about it, I should say, too, that Craigslist was an initial strategy for me. I still do that probably once a year or once every 6 months. But now I get almost all story submissions from people just because the show's grown in popularity. But you had asked, are there ones that just really blow my mind? Right. And I would say almost every other one does that to me, because you start out with a kernel of an idea. Someone will write to me maybe a paragraph about something that happened to them, and then you start talking to them, and it's so much more complicated than you thought. Like, I just interviewed a woman who was kidnapped. This will be an episode that comes in a few months. And she just wrote to me, my boyfriend dropped me off in a bad neighborhood in Atlanta, and I was kidnapped and mugged and barely escaped with my life. And that sounds intriguing. And once you get into it, there's just this unbelievably rich psychological history. She moved from a small town. The boyfriend was narcissistic, and it became this codependent relationship. And you just, every time you get these little germs of a story, there's so much more to it. And they're always something that I couldn't fathom. Another one that I did recently was a woman who was, whose mother tried to commit suicide. And then when I started interviewing her, it turned out she was a Jehovah's Witness. And there was just all of these religious crap that was layered on top of her story. And they almost always take some unusual turn that I'm not expecting. So I think I'm as astonished as my listeners are.
So you've got listener submissions and the occasional Craigslist piece. After that, sort of, what is the production process like? Obviously, you get some back and forth with these people, maybe email, maybe some phone calls or Skype. And then from that point, recording the interviews, editing. Take us through sort of what your average episode looks like.
So my average episode, I really prefer interviewing people in person. So that's the ideal. Now I have started interviewing people more remotely, but I had an issue with sound quality. I did some over Skype. I don't love to have Skype. I like it to be the best recording possible. I have just a $400 recorder with about a $100 microphone, and I send it in the mail. So I mail my recording equipment to people, and we do the phone interview, and then they mail it back to me. That's how I do most of my interviews. We interview generally for, I would say, an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then I spend about 10 hours editing that down to 20 minutes to 30 minutes.
Wow. It's again, you are I think you are giving people a lot of good ideas at this point. I've not heard of somebody mailing their recording equipment. Have you ever not gotten it back?
I've never not gotten it back. No.
Hey, fingers crossed.
I think
right?
I rely on the fact that after people share their most vulnerable experience with me, that we have enough of a connection. They'll want it to be aired. So if they don't send it back to me, it never airs, and that's my trust.
That's true.
It's my system of trust. Yeah.
All these people you've talked to, what happens after it goes out? It goes live. Do you hear from the storyteller at some point? Hear back from them? Do they give you positive or negative feedback on what happened when the story came out?
So far, I have never had anyone who has had a negative reaction, which is phenomenal. I'm waiting for that day. I am always a little nervous right when I publish it, that I send them the link, and I always consider the interviewee the person I'm really doing it for. Obviously, I do it for fans and listeners, but telling the person's story is the most important thing to me. And so their feedback is really key. And the only time I had to change something, one time someone had told a story and I forgot they had later on in the interview said, I don't want you to include that because it implicates someone else. And I published the episode. And so for about half a day, I'd included a story that they didn't want in there. And he wrote and said, I told you to take this out. And then I immediately did. And he was appreciative. And so, but yeah, so far, no negative reactions. Everyone's been very appreciative. A lot of people find it a very meaningful and valuable experience actually for them to listen to themselves telling the story. It's something, because these are massively life-changing events for people, they've obviously lived through it and told it and processed it so much. But really hearing it back from their own voice, I think, is something that can be really powerful for people.
On a personal note, do you ever kind of check back in with some of these? Because some of these people have been through or are going through a lot. Do you ever feel compelled, like 6 months later, be like, is everything okay? Should we touch base and anything like that?
I'm trying to think. I don't. Again, like a lot of them are not a lot, but I would say, maybe 15 or 20 of the episodes are people who are friends or friends of friends. So I get to catch up with those stories. I have been in email contact with a couple people. but I typically don't follow up with them. I really want to respect people's privacy and their desire to reach out to me. I'm sure they'd be happy if I did reach out and ask them, but I haven't really been too compelled. But now you're making me think I should. So
Well, I was just
maybe I will.
I was just curious, you know, that it would almost make me think some of these people, it's almost like I wish I had their email to almost be like, are you okay? You know, that type of feeling. You kind of get that from some of these episodes because some of these stories are just, and again, I've only recently, I've only cut out maybe the last, 20% of the releases here in the 5th season. And they're amazing. Although I want to kind of take off, I want to go off the main track here for a minute, Whit, if you can. I'm hoping, folks, all of you are jumping over and subscribing to this show that we're talking about. This is actually happening. If the way we're talking about it doesn't make it sound like something you've never heard before, believe me, you should be subscribing to this and checking it out. But recently, at the time of this recording, I just want your own personal opinions, maybe some behind-the-scenes things. Episode 70, What If You Had a Mind-Blowing Affair? This guy had a really interesting storytelling style, let's call it. Did you hear him the first time and ask yourself, is this for real?
Yes. He is a very interesting guy. His name is Jupiter Diego. He's the only person I've done 2 episodes with. So he actually has another one called What If You Lost a High-Speed Chase? He was a drug addict for a long time, lives in LA, and he is a storyteller in some regard. He has been, I don't know what he's been. I think he's been part of Porchlight and some other things. So he's one of the few people that is also sort of a not really professional storyteller, but he's been on the circuit to some extent. So he contacted me, and he had uploaded some of his stories to SoundCloud. And so I was able to listen to his style, and I was like, this guy is just so fascinating. And so I interviewed him about this, What If You Lost a High-Speed Chase? And that story is just totally wild. And then he said, hey, I have another one for you if you want to do a second. And I thought, well, I usually don't interview people twice, but, he has this great style, and he has such a weird, wonderful voice. And so I thought, let's capture it. And he's an unusual one, but he's really fun, and we have a great rapport. And he wants to do a third one, and I'm like, well, I don't know if I'm going to do a third one, but I think I may do a recording with him, and we can shop it around elsewhere to other podcasts or other storytelling formats, because I just love talking to him, and he loves my show. So.
He needs his own show at this point with just nothing but weekly intervals of his stories. I mean,
I know.
When I first started listening to 70, at first I thought, is this guy for real? But not even halfway through, you realize all the details and the nuances. Yeah. Oh, no, this is a true story.
It's a true story. Yep. I'm sure he certainly has his own perspective on it. And he is a wonderful has a wonderful description. So, I'm sure it's embellished to some extent from his perspective. This is another thing that I struggle with. I mean, anyone can be lying to me, right? I'm not a journalist. I don't do fact checking. I don't interview their friends or family or follow up on things. So truth in storytelling is a really interesting question. And I'm never really quite sure how to resolve that. One of my methods is to ask people several times and make sure their story is consistent. If I notice inconsistencies, I'll say, well, wait a minute, you said before it was this, and then we try to resolve that. But what I really am after is more the emotional truth. And so I'm sure the stories are always told from the person's perspective, especially when it involves like a boyfriend or husband or father or parent. I mean, early childhood memories, so many of those things are confabulated or embellished. And so people have asked me a lot about like, well, what if they're lying to you? And I say, I'm not really after the truth. I'm after the emotional truth.
And I was just thinking about that when you were speaking, that at first I thought it would matter, but in the end, it is, maybe I'm using that word storytelling and maybe you would prefer a different term, but it almost is one story. And whether it's actual or factual or embellished, I don't know is the important part, really. Like you said, it's that emotional truth. It's the story itself. And I think that's the kind of the higher purpose of this is actually happening.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, ultimately, no matter how much research you do, you're still not going to get the truth. We know this from Making a Murderer and Serial and these kinds of shows, right? You can spend a year investigating something, and ultimately it's not really what matters in the end.
But if you were to find out, maybe through that constant asking, that somebody was just flat out telling you a tale, would you go with it or no?
I have, there is one episode I did with a guy who told me that he was, so I have that episode, what if you were falsely accused of molesting your niece? And that was a bit of a tough one because I really was questioning whether or not this guy had been involved with his niece in some way. I ended up believing him, and I felt like he was so emotionally broken up over it that, again, it sort of captured his state, and whether or not what actually went on was not quite as important to me. But I met up with another guy who was arrested on child pornography charges, and he was eventually let go, and he claimed that it was this false thing and it had affected his life and it ruined his marriage and all these things. And he was creepy, and I was almost 100% sure that he actually did collect or film or was involved in some way in child pornography. And I've never published that interview, and I never will. And that's one of the few that I have not published. And I just felt like he was lying to me. I felt like he was a dangerous person. And I felt like the cops let him go falsely.
Right.
So,
I'm reminded of the recent episode of, I'm not sure if you've heard or not, Death, Sex, and Money, Anna Sale with WNYC. Their recent episode talked about these heroin addict couple that had been, quote, sober for 10 years and were changing their lives and all this other stuff. And then while they were kind of double checking the story that they were told, come to find out they were facing additional criminal charges that they didn't tell Anna or the producers or anything like that. And they debated on putting that episode out.
Yeah, it's a dilemma. I think it's really, and again, I don't follow up with these people. I don't interview their relatives or family. And it's just, it's hard to know. And a lot of my stories, some of them end with great uncertainty and pain, and others, they kind of wrap up nicely in a bow because the person says, oh, and now I'm better and I've survived. And, to what extent is that true that they've really turned the corner or that they've really gotten out of it? I actually tried to inject a little more ambiguity into the show in some way because they might say, and now I'm all better. And then all of a sudden, they give me these hints that, well, not everything's better, right? That there's still a lot of struggle there. So I try to capture it as much as I can. But, we as humans we like stories with endings, and people always like to believe that they're at a better place.
Let's talk about some of the creative choices you made with the show. There is almost no wit anywhere. You talk about the interviews that you do, and then on one of the episodes you appeared on an Audible ad, and I'm like, it's a real guy. I gotta find him. And I'm serious about this. It actually took me a bit to find out who you were because it's very much about the show, and it's great, very much about the guests, right? The storyteller and their experience. Can you tell folks a little bit about sort of why you've positioned the show that way and what you find comes from that?
That was a very early on choice that I made. And actually, it was one of the inspirations for my show was that I love podcasts. I love This American Life. I love Love and Radio. There are a lot of Snap Judgment is fantastic. They all have these incredible stories to tell, but I always feel that the narrators are involved too much. I think they tell too much of the story. And I think if you ask questions creatively, you don't need to be part of it. And I really wanted to capture the feeling of, you sat down in a bar and you met a stranger and they told you all about their life, or you're on a plane and you just get this incredible window into someone else's life. And so it was a very early on choice to eliminate myself and not make it about me.
Unless it's for Audible.
Unless it's for Audible,
Thank
yes.
Goodness.
Fingers crossed that they sponsor me more often. That was sort of a pilot run with them, and we'll see if my show keeps growing. they'll sponsor more. But yeah, unless it's doing an ad, which I even that I'm reluctant to do, but it helps cover the cost. So.
Let's talk about other creative choices. I've noticed scrolling through sort of the list of episodes on the website, you've sort of expanded. You can almost say doubled the episode length, almost on average. Was that a concerted effort as well?
It was. I think I started to evolve as an interviewer. I got more details. I started to be able to probe deeper into the story. I think when I first started doing it, even though I had done tons of interviewing in my life as part of my job as a researcher, I think I was still a little reluctant to get at some of the harder stuff. And it made for shorter interviews in the long run, shorter episodes. And so when you have more material, it's just harder to cut out than, my original interviews are probably about an hour and 15 minutes, and now almost always they're 2 hours. So.
Are you comfortable with the length, or do you think it's still kind of an under review situation? Because you could probably make these a little bit longer, I imagine.
Yeah, I always wrestle with that. I like that I think it's one of the reasons people tend to binge listen to my show. And I think one of the reasons is because they are these short episodes. And I don't know. I also think there are a lot of podcasts out there they're just people talking about stuff for like 2 hours. And I don't get it. Honestly, it's not my style. I know some people love that. Actually, my friend Nathan, who has made the films with me, he loves those kinds of things because he feels like they're friends in his head that he gets to carry around with him around the city, which is wonderful. I think that's why those shows are popular. But I'm the opposite. Actually, that's funny too. I should say when I first went to college, I went to Sarah Lawrence College, 1997. And I was originally a poetry major. That's how I got into college, on my poetry. And I've always been one for distilling the essence of something into a powerful, short but sweet message.
That's 2 weeks in a row I've talked to somebody whose earlier career or schooling was involved with poetry. You may know Al Letson was in sort of slam poetry, and back in the day, if you will. It's kind of how he got his start on the stage and with a microphone as well. So maybe I'm on to kind of a string of this constant trait and background in some of my favorite shows.
Yeah. Poetry is an incredible teacher. We actually had, just as a side story, my professor was Thomas Lux. He's an unbelievable poet and just one of the best, old school style apprenticeship mentors, like Zen master type of relationship. And Sarah Lawrence has, a 12-to-1 student teacher ratio or something like that. So we had these very intimate classes. He spent a lot of time with students and really challenged you to hone your craft. And the first day of class, or the first couple of weeks, he had us bring in our list of favorite words. And everyone had to list, I think it was 20 of your favorite words. And, you're 19 and you come in with all these words like ambrosia and all these flowery, wonderful, long words. And he took the paper and he just would cross them off. It was he just went down and eliminated 90% of the words that you had on these papers. He's like, never use this in a poem, never use this in a poem, never use this in a poem. And it was brilliant because you just, and it's that whole idea, kill your darlings. Like people always talk about that, but with poetry, you really have to kill your darlings. You have to figure out how to tell something extremely complex and get someone, right there on the page with you in, maybe 100 words.
So when I talked to Al Letson last week, he said that poetry was great for him, but he knew he had a lot more to tell than 3 to 4 minutes, which was what he was given during those sort of national poetry competitions. Uh-huh. Did that sort of provide a jumping off point for you in terms of the documentary films or this podcast, that there was much more than sort of the brevity that is required by so often anyways by the form of poetry?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Oh, absolutely. Poetry has its limitations. And I think, a lot of it too was just I wanted a job someday. So
this is a good driver, Whit.
this is a
good motivator.
Being able to eat every day is important.
I've heard.
No, it was. I started getting interested in psychology, and I really felt I felt I could just do a lot more with psychology, and that poetry could always be part of my life. I didn't feel like I had to give it up just because I wasn't a full-time poet, but that to be a psychologist, to kind of explore another career, required a lot more training. And so that was my jumping off point.
Let's change gears all the way back to something I said at the very beginning. I found out about this is actually happening from Snap Judgment when they featured your story on the What If I Woke Up in a Morgue? Was that the one? No, Dead Man Walking.
Yeah, they called it.
But it's the same one, right?
It's the same one. Yes.
I knew I wasn't crazy.
Yeah,
they called it Dead Man Walking. You called it What If You Woke Up in a Morgue?
They did, yeah.
So what's that like? Is that have there been other instances where other shows have sort of asked to feature one of your episodes, or you asked them to?
Yes, I've done 3 episodes with them now. The first one was actually with Jupiter Diego, the guy we were talking about before. His What If You Lost a High-Speed Chase became an episode of theirs called Lucky 8 Ball. And yeah, so I've actually done 3 with them. I have a great relationship with them. I might even start attending their pitch meetings. So we'll see. But yeah, it's a great way for them too to get content ready made, right? And then they typically edit mine down. They probably take out about a half or 2/3 of it, and they edit it down. So they take another stab at it as well.
What's the experience like from when that happens? I imagine you see sort of an influx of people coming to check out the show.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The first time I was on it, I think it tripled my listenership because I think back then I had something like 7,000 or 8,000 subscribers, and it immediately jumped to about 16,000. And then the daily numbers were almost triple, right? Just nice. One-time listeners. And now I'm up to about 30,000 subscribers. So it's really grown a lot.
I think you're in some kind of hotbed out there for podcasts because, and I keep bringing up my last week's guest with Al, but they're in Oakland, right? Reveal's in Oakland. Isn't Snap Judgment? Aren't
Snap
they also?
Judgment?
Aren't there? And then you're out that way. You guys are all kind of right there, Bay Area.
We're right here, and Roman Mars, 99% Invisible, is also here.
Yeah, another previous guest. I was going to bring that up as well. And yeah, it seems like there is, obviously that area is big for a lot of reasons, Silicon Valley or what have you, but it seems like a lot of great sort of public radio podcast storytelling is happening in that area. Does it feel kind of like that rich environment for this?
It does. I'm sure everyone's aware of the housing prices in San Francisco.
See comment on finding job and feeding.
Exactly. So yeah, I live in Oakland, and I moved here about 7 years ago in part of the mass migration away from the unbelievably ridiculous prices in San Francisco. You don't get into a conversation with someone here without getting away from talking about real estate at some point. So yeah, Oakland is taking off right now. It's such an incredible place because everyone's migrating from the city here, and no one can afford to live there who's a creative type. So it is a hotbed.
Well, I know a lot of great things that I've been listening to has been coming out there. It's amazing how often it seems to be that Oakland is a common refrain. We were talking a minute about the listeners and the increase in listeners. What is some of the feedback been like over these last several years you've been putting the show together? What are some of the things you've been hearing from listeners?
What are the things I've been hearing from them just feedback-wise?
Yeah, are you bombarded with a bunch of positive comments, or do you have any complainers or somebody tell you some real personal effect that maybe you received, they received from having listened to an episode, anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people binge listen to it. So I have a lot of people who write me, and they kind of say like, this has taken up the last week of my life, and they've listened to 50 episodes in a row.
That's kind of my feeling here lately.
I'm always blown away by that. Honestly, it's pretty amazing the amount of time people spend listening to these shows. It's wonderful. I think I have gotten a few, not really negative comments, I've gotten a few people who just didn't like someone a lot. They felt that I shouldn't have highlighted their story because they personally didn't like the person. And I don't really respond to that kind of stuff. But it's like, it's not my job to make whether or not you like someone. It's about telling their story. And actually, I think it's really important that we capture the perspective of someone who's unlikable. And so I think that, there have been those are really the only negative comments, is like, oh, why did you highlight this person? I actually think that the falsely accused of molesting your niece, that's probably gotten the most responses, because it's either one way or the other. Some people who wanted to reach out to the guy, and other people who were kind of disgusted by him, thought he was lying, thought he was a horrible person, made a lot of assumptions about him. So, and I'm like, hey, that's your opinion. And I think, I'll just leave it there.
So let's talk a little bit about the future here, Whit. Any future plans, any ways that or thoughts that you've had about things you might want to do with the show? Any ideas at all that maybe you could share with us?
Well, my next task is to potentially publish it into a book.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, I'm going to try to pitch it as a book. I think if I took the sort of top 20, 25 episodes, I think about my parents, for example. They would never listen to podcasts if I wasn't making one.
Right.
But they're avid readers. And so it's the kind of book that I think would do well on the shelves, potentially. It's a nice, bold cover. This is actually happening, true tales from the unknown or whatever. And kind of, so I'm going to try to do that. And it feeds into a larger project for me. I think, at the heart of my podcast is really the sense of uncertainty that we all live with. And when going back to sort of one of the reasons behind my show is that I've always been fascinated by ambiguity, and how we all walk around the world with so little information about how to live our lives. And we also walk around with so little control over what actually goes on in our life. We love to believe we have control, and we do put all these things in place to make ourselves believe we have control. But ultimately, we are contingent upon so many factors that we don't understand. And I really think that that's our common humanity. Our common humanity is uncertainty. And it's something I really try to drive home in my show by presenting these stories of people caught in the middle of that. And so I don't know where that's going to go. I would love to write a book someday, a larger work in psychology. For the podcast, though, I'm just going to keep doing it until I run out of stories.
Well, I think turning this into a book, that you said the top 20 episodes or whatever into a book would be a great idea. It reminds me of another previous guest, and I follow him on Twitter and been seeing everything he's put out there. Aaron Menke with Lore just put together a sort of a paperback version of his episodes. Basically, he took the transcripts and turned them into pages, and he was showing pictures of those that he was shipping out to his Patreon backers. And I'm thinking, man, I should have backed him on Patreon. It looked great. He knew an artist. They did cover art and what have you. So give Aaron a call, because I think he did exactly what you're trying to do. So
that's a great tip.
Yeah, he's and it looked great. And I'm thinking to myself, man. And he said he wasn't going to sell them, only to Patreon backers. I'm like, darn it. But another thing I was thinking too is and this might have to be one of those lose the day job things, but then the food comes back up. But boy, I could also see this being a live show. All Mortified or The Moth or what have you. Having people tell these type of stories live would be really interesting as well.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Although, this is a good point too. One of the other, not critiques I have, but there's something to be said for formal storytelling that's rehearsed and it's, emphasized and everyone, it's acted. And there's something else to be said for people who can't get up on stage, right?
Right.
I feel like about half these people would be so much worse off were they on stage.
Yeah.
And even just in my editing, I take out all the ums and the likes and the suspensions and, all these habits that we have of speech that people who are not professional can't convey. So I sort of turn them into storytellers through the editing process. And there's something really valuable about that. You're right, though. I mean, a lot of these, it would be great these kinds of stories to share them more widely, of course, any platform. But it was a thrust behind my show. It's why The Moth is wonderful, but it's what makes my show unique because I'm just in conversation with them.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm a huge fan of it, Whit. I really am. And folks, you need to go over and check out This Is Actually Happening. I guarantee you will stop what you're doing when you're listening to some of these episodes. And I always know that I'm onto something great when I literally stop and say, whoa, what? And hit the rewind button and did I just hear what I actually heard? And that's happened a couple of times, and I've only been through sort of the last dozen or so. So, Whit, before I let you go, I want you to take just a moment. Tell folks, we alluded to it a bit ago, but where they can find the podcast, your documentaries, and anything else you'd like to tell people that you're doing.
Sure. So my website is permatemp.org. You can find links to the film there. The short film is there in full length. The other one is all contained in Void. I'm still shopping around a little bit, so it's only the trailer. All my podcast episodes are there. I'm also part of the Misfit podcast network, and so you can go to misfitrad.io, so Misfit Radio, and they have a number of other great podcasts, so that's where you can find me online.
Excellent. And I'm going to have the links to Misfit Radio and to permatemp.org all online or in the show notes as well, folks. So check those out. And I couldn't recommend it enough. Whit, thank you very much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks so much, Dan. This was great.
Awesome, folks. That will do it for episode 82. If you've enjoyed it, tell a friend, leave a review. Guys, in case you didn't hear me say earlier, I am now actually on Patreon, making a fool of myself in public. So if you do like what I do here, talking to these great hosts and producers of some of your favorite shows, a cup of coffee a month wouldn't hurt as well. Folks, until next week, my name's Dan Lizette, and I will talk to you then.
Thank you for listening to the Podcast Digest. You can follow the show on Twitter at PodDigest. Like the show on Facebook at facebook.com/The Podcast Digest. Email the show feedback at thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And you can find all the previous episodes and exclusive blog entries at the show's website, thepodcastdigest.info.